Hello, today we are going to start with the 15-mark pseudocode question. That is the last question in our question paper, and most students find this difficult. However, today we are going to apply a very effective method known as the 4-box method that is going to really help you solve any question like this easily. So the very first step is to read the question. However, you have to keep in mind that after reading this question, you would barely get anything and you are going to be very confused. However, the method that I'm going to tell you today is going to make things more simpler. So the first step is that you have to read the question. However, you have to keep in mind that you have to read this question thrice. I'm telling you again that you have to read this question thrice, and you don't have to jump into conclusions straight away. I will tell you what to do. So, first you have to read this question thrice. So let's first read this question and understand what's going on. So a one-player game uses 2D array grid. So the array name we've been given is grid to store the location of a secret cell to be found by player in 10 moves. Each row and column has 5 cells. Okay, so this is a 2D array and the name of the array is grid. This in which we have 5 rows and 5 columns. Here is column number 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. 5 columns and 5 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, what else? At the start of the game, the program places an X in a random cell. Okay, for example, random means like it can be anywhere in this grid. For example, here. However, you have to keep in mind that not in grid 1, 1. Grid is the array name, 1 is the row position, and the other one is the column position. Row 1, column 1 means X cannot be here. This value is exempted from the value of X. Okay, so what else? The player starts at the top left of the grid. So the player starts from here, from 1, 1 position. The player has total of 10 moves. Okay, now we know that we can't put an X in the 1, 1 position, and we know the starting position, and we know that we have 10 moves. Okay, what next? During the game, the player can move left, right, up or down by 1 cell, and the move must be within the grid. So we cannot move beyond the boundaries of 5, okay? And we can move left, right, up or down by 1 cell. Like for example, if I'm standing here or here, I can move right, left, up or down, okay? Next, you win is displayed if the player moves to the cell with X and has played 10 moves or less. Now, for example, I'm starting from here and I need to get into the position X in less than 10 moves, and if I do so, I'm going to win. So if I go 1 box down, here I did my first move. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In 6 moves, I can get to the position X, and once I get there, I'll be displayed on the screen that you win. However, you lose if you cannot get to the position X and you've already made 10 moves, okay? My bad. Okay, write a program that meets these requirements. You must use pseudocode or program code, add comments to explain how your code works. Now, let me tell you, if you read this question first, initially, without any help, you are barely going to get anything, okay? So I told you to read this question thrice, and you have to do so. Once you read this, now you don't have to jump into conclusions. Now I'm going to give you a method first, then you have to start solving the questions, okay? Now here I'm going to tell you the method that you are going to use before you solve this question. So this method is known as a 4-box method. You have to take a pencil and make 4 boxes. The 4 boxes should label input, variables, conditions, and end. You have to memorize this template because it's going to help you in any kind of question. So these first 4 boxes, the first one's name is input, the second one is variables, the third one is condition, and the fourth one is end. Now I am going to tell you what are you going to do with these boxes. First you have to memorize this template. Okay, so now how do we fill in these boxes? The first one that is labeled as input, what you have to do with this. Okay, you have to go to your question, and after you've read the question thrice, now you have to think what inputs do you need in the question. Now here we see what inputs do you need to take from the user. Okay, so you read here that the player can move left, right, up or down, right? However, it's up to the user's choice that it wants to move left, right, up or down. So this is basically where it goes into the input category. So the input category is the player move. So I'm going to write down player move. Player move. And there are basically four um four options do we have, like up, down, left or right. Okay, so this was the first input that I needed. Now I'm going to check in my question again that if we need another input in our question or not. Here you can see that it says that the program places an X in a random cell. Now this happens randomly, like the computer generates this. It can generate an X here or here. It is totally random. Okay, so this is also an input that we need to take from the computer itself. Now I'm going to write here X position. These are the two inputs that we need to take in order for the game to start. Okay, X position and the player move up, down, left or right. Next, now you have to identify what variables do you need. It means what things that you need to change in the program. Okay, now I have to identify what changes in my program, what things are variable. Okay, so in my grid, for example, let me first erase these mess up. Okay, so as you know, before the game starts, the user start position is here. So this is our tiny little player. He's standing over here at the start position before the game has started. And before the game starts, the computer is going to generate a random variable X. And basically, let's just suppose it generates it here. Which position is this? It is row number 5 and column number 3, which means the position is 5, 3. And the start position is 1, 1. As you can see, he's standing here. Now, one thing I have to ask you, that is this constant? Is he gonna stand here forever, or he's going to change his row, or he's going to change his column, right? So wouldn't it be a variable? The position of the player would be a variable, alright? Like for example, this man here, he moves to the right. It means he changed his column, or he moves to the down. It means he changed his row. So basically, there are two variables. One is the player row, or one is the player column that it can change depending on the position. For example, he can't move here, but like if suppose he was standing here, now it's his choice where he wants to move, like up, left, down, right. Like it can change its position anywhere it wants from cell to cell. And to store his position, we are going to take two variables. One is the player row and one is the player column. So now you can see that it moved from 1 1 to 3 1. So now let's store. First, right here that we need two variables to store the position of the tiny man there. One is the player row. I won't write player, so let me just write player p row, okay? Or player column. These are the things that can change throughout the game, right? So whatever can change in the game, you have to write down in this box. Now let's check what else do we need to change. Now one more thing to keep in mind here. Now you can see X is fixed, right? Like the man needs to come and get to the position X, right? Now the thing is that for each new game, X is going to be randomly stored. For example, this on the first game, X was stored here. In the second game, it is going to be stored here or here. It is totally random, right? So it can change. So like basically X has different positions of rows and columns. So it is also going to be stored as a variable. So I'm going to write, so this is for the player, and two more variables for the X row and X column. X row and X column. This is random, that's why this is variable, okay? So now one more thing that needs to change throughout the game. Now for example, wait. Now suppose my X was generated here and I'm at the starting position. Now the number of moves I have to take is also variable. Now here 1 move, 2 move, 3 move. I can get till here, right? However, I can get here like this as well. 1, 2 in 2 moves. So the number of the moves the user can take is also variable. So I'm going to write here number of moves. Number, excuse my writing here. Number of moves. Now the last thing that you have to keep in mind for the variables is now this game, either the user who is playing this, he wins or not, or he loses. So basically there are just two possible outcomes, either win or not. So I'm going to store one last variable here which is known as win, which is going to determine whether the user won or lost. I'm going to tell you the uses of all these once we go to the solution. Now we are done with the box 1 input, the box 2 variables. Now we have to identify the conditions, the requirements of the game. Now you have to find the condition, or I can say the rules the question have specified for you. Now here the question says that the user cannot pass the boundary, like it needs to be till here, like the boundary is 5, right? 5 rows and 5 columns. It can't move like outside of this grid. Okay, so I will say here the grid is the boundary, so we need to be very careful to not move outside the grid. What else? So here the first thing that is written in bold here, not in grid 1 1, it means that the variable x cannot be stored. It can be stored anywhere in this grid except this position. X cannot be here, so I'm going to write x cannot be at 1 1. X not. So let me just write a cross at 1 1. 1 1. One more thing that the question has specified here is that the player has 10 moves. Okay, so it can't move more than 10 places. So the player has total of 10 moves, and if he completes the game within the 10 moves and finds X, it's going to end. Okay, he's going to win. These were the three conditions given to us in the question, which is also done. Now in the last box, we need to determine when the game is going to stop. Either the player makes 10 moves and wins or loses. Basically, after 10 moves, the game ends. Now, given this all, we are going to create a solution to our problem. Now you can see that we have broken down our solution into much simpler steps, right? Okay, so the first step towards our solution was to create a random X position for the game to start, right? So let me first generate a random position X. So first, whatever you're doing, first write it down in comments, okay? So that the examiner finds it easy to understand your code. Okay, so I'm writing here generating a random variable X. However, you need to know the condition that X cannot be at 1 1. Okay, so you have to keep in mind all the things you've written in the box. Okay, so cannot be, brackets cannot be at 1 1. Okay, so how would we do this? Since we need two coordinates for the row and for the column, and it needs to be totally random, so first variable that I want to take is the X row. Here you have to see that in the box you created the variables X row and X column, right? So I'm going to write here X row and X column. Okay, so these both are totally random. So how would we do that? X row is equal to, you have to write the random function, random, any number between 1 to 5. Why? Because you know there are only 5 rows and 5 columns, okay? And you cannot exceed the boundary. So the row can be any number from 1 to 5. As you can see here, this is a complete weight. So this is one complete row and it can be any number from 1 to 5. And the same with the column, it can be any number from 1 to 5, okay? So where is my solution now? Now, as I told you that you have to keep the box in mind, that I told you X cannot be 1 1. So how are we going to prevent from for the random variable to generate 1 1? I don't want it to generate the position 1 1. So I'm going to apply a loop here that you have to repeat this action until my X row is not equal to 1 or and these both condition needs to be satisfied. That's why I put the AND condition. Okay, so like both row and column shouldn't be 1 1. X column should not be equal to 1. So this is the first block of code that we satisfied in the question. We generated a random X variable, the row coordinates and the column one as well, and we also made sure that it won't be at the starting position 1 1 by making a statement here that X row should not be equal to 1. This sign shows not equal to, and X column should also not be equal to 1. Okay, for your convenience, if you still don't understand what does X row and X column do, for example, this random variable, this is a function, like it is an inbuilt function that is going to return you any random variable, random number from 1 to 5. Now, for example, in the row, it gives me a number from 1 to 5, which is 2. And in the column from 1 to 5, it gives me, for example, 5. So it gave me the coordinates 2, 5. Now, if you want to locate this in my question, second row, fifth column. This is my second row, and this is my fifth column, which means X is generated here. This was just an example of how this works. Now let's move on to what the question needs further from us. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind, that this was just a row and this was the column. They both are separate. Now how do I use this in my grid array? Like I want this like this, X row and X column, but these two are separately generated. Like for example, this generates 2, this generates 5. However, I want it in my grid, like grid position 2 and 5. So I'm going to store this all in a single variable X. So what was the array name? It was grid. The positions were random, which was X row that was generated above, and X column, the C is capital, and the brackets are closed, and this, oh my god, just look at the spelling, column. Okay, this needs to be stored in the variable X. Like now this random variable 2 5, this is the position X. It is stored like this. Coordinates randomly generated are stored in the variable X. So far till here we have satisfied the random variable condition. Now one more thing that you had to keep in mind, that the player starts from 1 1. So we need to tell the program that we have to start from here as well. So how are we going to do that? We are going to initialize the player move from 1 and 1. As I told you, this tiny little man, we had two variables for it. Its row coordinate and the column, and it both needs to start from 1 initially. So it's very easy. Let's just give him the values 1 and 1. Okay, so first let me comment and tell my examiner what am I doing. So I'm initializing my starting values. So player row, it needs to start from 1, and player column also needs to be 1. Let me comment this down here, that player starts at row 1, and here the player starts at column 1. Okay, now in the variable section, what do I need to initialize? Okay, we are done with the player row and the player column. It was initialized to 1. Okay, Now the number of moves first. What are the number of moves the user has moved? Has the user moved yet? It hasn't. So I'm going to initialize it to 0 yet. It hasn't moved yet. So initially it's going to be 0. So here I'm going to write number of moves is equal to 0. It means that player hasn't moved yet. Moved yet. Okay, so what was the maximum number of moves that I was allowed? We need to check that also in our program. So I'm going to declare, like, initialize maximum moves to 10. Like, we can't exceed this. Max limit user can move. Okay. Now, since my game hasn't started yet, and I also have to keep a check on whether the user wins or not. So I'm going to initialize a variable named win to false. Like, the user hasn't won yet, so I will initialize it to false. So here I'm going to write win is equal to false. Now let's go and write our main program, how our game is going to work. Now, since my game hasn't started yet, and I also have to keep a check on whether the user wins or not. So I'm going to initialize a variable named win to false. Like, the user hasn't won yet, so I will initialize it to false. So here I'm going to write win is equal to false. Now let's go and write our main program, how our game is going to work. Okay, now we've initialized our X, we've initialized the starting position. Now what else do we need to do? Now the game starts. Now the user has to decide it wants to move right, left, up or down. So we are going to output a message to the user to take an input from the user. So let's do that. Now I want to make the user know that I want an input from you. So I'm going to type enter the move up, left, down, right. Wait, right. Okay, so let me just lowercase this as well. This will be output to the user, and to take an input we are going to write input, and whatever the user types in, up, down, left or right, we are going to store it in a variable player move. So now, for example, the user chooses to move right, then it's going to be stored in this variable player move. Okay, one thing to keep in mind here is, for example, my user is standing at the starting position and it enters the incorrect move. For example, it chooses to go up. However, this is the boundary, it can't move up or left. So I'm going to take a variable known as the valid move to check whether the user has moved into the correct position or not, or is it moving beyond the boundaries. So let me take a variable, a valid move, and assign it to true first. I have to assume that the user first enters the correct move, then I'm going to check if it has moved correctly or not. First, like, let me initialize it to some value which is true. So I'm here assume the move is valid. Okay, now let's take input from the user, up, left, down or right. So I'm going to take a variable named win is equal to false. So now the user has to decide it wants to move right, left, up or down. So I'm going to initialize it to some value which is true. So I'm here assuming the move is valid. Okay, now let's take input from the user, up, left, down or right. Now I store the initial values like the start value in the player row and player column. However, wherever the user moves, for example, it moves here and then here and then here, right? I want to keep track of the positions, the coordinates of rows and columns that it needs to move. So I need to take a temporary variable in which I'm going to store I'm going to keep a track of the user's movement. So I'm going to store every move into that variable. So I'm going to take a temporary variable for the user's moves, okay? Like if the user changes row, I'm going to take a temporary variable for it, and if it changes column, I'm going to take a temporary for that as well. So let me write here temp means temporary, row is equal to, now at first the beginning the user starts at 1 1, so I'm going to initialize it to the player row, which was 1, and temporary column is equal to player column. So these were the initial values that we stored 1 1 in it, and these values change again and again depending on the user's moves. That's why I made a different variables for the row and the column that changes again and again. Okay, now let's create a choice selection for the user. So I'm going to take the case, which is the easiest option for multiple options that we need to choose. Case of player move. Okay, so there are 4 cases. The first one is the left. If the user inputs left, what are we going to do? If the user enters right, right, what are we going to do? And the other 2 options, which are up or down. So now suppose my player is standing here and it clicks and it chooses the left option. Okay, so what is going to happen? You can see if the player chooses to go left, what is going to happen? The row is going to remain the same. It's still going to remain in the same row. However, the column changes from position 3 to position 2. Now what happened? My column value was 3 and it changed to 2. It decremented to -1, right? Okay, now whenever the user chooses left, I'm going to decrement in the column value. I'm going to minus the column to -1, so that the coordinates changes from 3 to 2. It's just an example that if we go to the left, the column value is going to change. It's going to decrease. However, the row is not going to change, so I'm not going to change the row value. It's still 2. It's still in the same row. Okay, so I'm going to write here player column -1. However, this is going to be stored into this value, temporary column. I told you I need to keep a track on the user's move, and I need to take a temporary variable for that, and I took temporary column, and I want to store this new position of the user into the value of temporary column. Okay, Now, if the user chooses right, suppose I'm going to erase this. Suppose now it was standing here, okay? And now I want to move right. I'm still in the same row. However, my column increases one position. So I'm going to increment +1 in the column position and store it into the temp column. So I'm going to write here temp column but I'm going to just do the same. The only difference is that I have to +1 in it. The row remains same, so I don't care about the row for now. Now, what if the user chooses up or down? Okay, so now for example, the user chooses up. Now you can see the column remains same. The user is still in the same column, in the column 3. Only the row changes from 2 to 1. So I'm going to just change the row values for up and down. Now here you can see that first it was in row number 2, but if I choose to go up, my row number decreases by -1. First it was 2, then it became 1, so it decremented with the value of -1. So I am going to store in the temporary row -1 if I choose up. So I'm going to write temp row is equal to player row -1. And the same case, if I go down, just the row position is going to increase. So I'm going to write it the same here and +1, but I'm still going to show you the visualization of this. For example, my player chooses to go down. It is still in the same column number 3. However, it just changes from row 2 to row 3. So that's why my row position gets +1. Okay, so as you saw here, I just did all of this. However, I stored them into the temporary variables. Okay, because these values can change again. The user can choose left again, right again, up again, until it has like done like 10, a maximum of 10 moves. Okay, now what if the user enters something else rather than left, right, up or down, like an invalid input? Now we will check if the user has input this the correct value. So if the user inputs any other value apart from left, right, up or down, we are going to update the valid parameter, the valid variable. Here I created valid move. It was true. However, if the user enters another letter or something else, I'm going to just make this false because it's not valid. Valid move is equal to false. And here the case ends. End case. Okay, now you can see I don't want this to happen once, right? Like there needs to be 10 moves, right? And the valid also needs to be true. So I am going to I'm going to apply a loop here that you have to repeat this thing. Now I'm going to tell you the terminating condition as well, but for now this all is going to repeat. Now you might have noticed that we didn't check for boundaries. Now I told you at the start, let me erase this. Okay, I told you that for example if the user is standing here and it chooses left, it can't go left because there's no grid here. And for example if the user is here and it moves to go, it wants to go right, it can't go. It wants to go up, it can't go. So how are we going to check if the move the user has entered is valid or not? So I'm going to make an if statement here. Selection. We have to check a particular criteria. If it meets, then we are going to continue with the game. So if, now you can see I calculated the positions of the user. Now if temp column is less than 1 or temp column is greater than 5, what happens if my column value exceeds 5 or it like moves below the 1 value? It is an invalid boundary, right? Then I'm going to update my variable of valid move again. Okay, so if this condition satisfies, if the boundary is less than 1 or greater than 5, which is incorrect, which is totally wrong, because we have 1 to 5 boundary values. So I'm going to change valid move false. And here I forgot to write a then as well. Then now, not only for columns, I want to check this for my rows as well. Like it shouldn't move from beyond this row or beyond this row. So I have to check it for my row values as well. It shouldn't exceed 5 or less than 1. Okay, so first let me end my condition here and start a new condition. So and if this ends here, and I'm going to make a new if condition. So here I did the same thing for the row values, that should not be less than 1 or greater than 5. If it was greater than 5 or less than 1, then the valid move is going to be false. Okay, this just checks that whether the user has entered a valid move or not. If it hasn't, then it is going to store false in the valid variable. Okay, now till here we were just checking if the user has entered correct values of left, right, up or down. Now what if the user does correct the valid values like left, right, up or down, and it does not exceed the boundaries? Then what are we going to do? Now we are going to proceed with the game. If valid move, now you can see I initialized valid move here is equal to true. Now if it remains true and it doesn't satisfy these conditions, like nothing is invalid, if valid move remains true, then what we are going to do, then we are going to store the temporary values again into our permanent variables, which was temporary row is equal to again player row, and temporary column temp column player column. I stored my temporary values again into my variables of player row and player column. This temporary values were just to check if the move was valid or not. Okay, so if this was true, if there were no errors, then the user has completed its first move. So I'm going to update the number of moves as well. Number of moves is equal to number of moves plus 1. This is going to keep a track that there are total of 10 moves. So here I just incremented. Here it basically, this whole sentence, can say the line of code, counts the number of moves. Now we are going to check if our player has reached the X position. So we are going to check if X is reached. So if the player does reaches X, it wins. Okay, so I'm going to type here if grid player row player column, it was just COL, is equal to X, then output to the user that that person wins. You win. Now I'm going to update my value of win. Win is equal to 2. Here in the box values, I told you that we will store a variable win to check whether the user won or not. Okay, so now let me just terminate the if conditions. Like this if ends here, and if. So let me just type and if here, and if, and this if ends here. This was all if the user does win, and if for this one, and this one is for the outer loop, and if. Now one thing to keep in mind, that this was a loop. It has to repeat until move error remains true. So we have to write until, okay, sorry, let me just type it, until move error, what have I done, until the valid move is equal to true. This has to repeat until valid move is equal to true. Now one thing that remained we didn't check. Let me check our box conditions. We checked the boundary that it should not exceed 5 or should not be less than 1. We also checked that X should not be at the first position. However, we didn't check that the moves should be less than or equal to 10. So this whole program only runs if the number of moves is less than 10. So how are we going to check that? Okay, so here you can see this was where the main game started, right? This was just the initialization of things. Now here I'm going to set a condition that the moves are only equal to or less than 10. So this whole thing is going to just work if the total number of moves is less than or equal to 10. So I'm going to write a condition here, while maximum number of moves. Okay, so wait a second. Okay, so here we saw that I stored the number of moves in this variable. So our number of moves should be less than 10. So I'm going to write here while num of moves is less than maximum number of moves, which is 10. Less than, you can directly write 10 or max moves, less than or equal to max moves. Two conditions needs to be satisfied, and not win. Here you can see my win was false yet, like it hasn't turned true yet. So we are going to execute this whole program until the number of moves is less than max moves, which is 10, and I haven't won yet. Now here my while condition starts while number of moves is less than. This is going to end here. End while. Okay. Oh my god. What is this? Okay, I'm going to fix this. Here I'm going to end my while. Now one other condition only remains, a small one. What if the user doesn't win? We have to just output the user you didn't win, and let me just do it. Wait. So I'm going to write here if win. Here I change the win to true. However, if win remains false, if win is equal to false, then output you lose. And if. So this was our whole game. Now I'm going to give you a summary of everything. Now let's go through the summary of the whole code. Okay, so first we have to generate a random row, a random column, and store the both coordinates in one position known as the x variable. Okay, so my player starts from the position 1 and column is 1, so both are 1 1. Number of moves is 0. We have to keep account of it, like number of moves is equal to number of plus 1, as we did earlier. Maximum number of moves is equal to 10 and win is false yet. So while the number of moves is less than or equal to 10, or maximum number of moves here I stored, and not win, I haven't won yet, or win is equal to false. Okay, so first I'm going to initialize a valid variable and initialize it to true. First I have to take an input from the user, up, left, down or right, and then store it into the player move variable. Then I'm going to take the initial values 1 and 1 and I'm going to store it into the temporary values of row and column. Okay, now I have to repeat this. I gave the user the options left, right, up and down, and based on these options my column and row values are going to be changed and stored into the temp column or temp row. Okay, here I just checked if the user has input a valid value, like if it has entered anything other than these four, then the valid move is going to be false. Here our case ends, and here we check the boundary values of column and row. If it's less than 1 or greater than 5, then valid move is equal to false, which means it's not valid. Here basically this is a variable to check if the move is valid, then it's going to be true, else it's going to be false. And this was just for the rows. It shouldn't exceed 5 or be less than 1. Okay, now what if the user moves were valid? Then if it remained true, if it never changed to false, then we are going to update the number of moves to +1. Now number of moves is going to 1, 2, 3 and is going to be all the way is going to go until the user wins or it reaches 10. Okay, now we have to check if the x position has reached. If it has reached, like if grid player row player column is equal to x, then the user wins. Okay, now we have to repeat this whole thing until valid move remains true. If it remains false, then it won't work. Okay, however, if win is equal to false, then you have to output you lose. When will win remain is equal to false? If grid player row player column will not be equal to x, win will never change to true and it remains false. That's why if it remains false, then we have to output you lose. So this was the end of the whole question.